In Middle-earth, there are many places that are no strangers to battles and wars. The plain of Daggerlad beyond the Black Gate of Mordor, the Weather Hills in the Old Kingdom of Arnor, or the Fords of Isen at the western border of Rohan. But none of these places saw more frequent conflicts than a land that was often the battleground between the men of Gondor and the various Southron peoples in Harad. So in this video, we talk about the land of South Gondor, more commonly known as Harondor. If you look at a map of Middle-earth, Harondor isn't actually hard to find. It's quite a large region, situated between the River Poros and the Anduin in the north, the Efelduath in the east, the River Harnan in the south, and the Bay of Belfalas to the west. It's also split in half by the Harad Road, which runs down from Gondor before trailing off to an unknown location in the deserts of near Harad. As for the exact description of Harondor, we're not really given one. On the map, it's described as a desert and debatable land, but it's unclear in this case whether desert refers to the geography or whether the land was deserted by the time of the War of the Ring thanks to constant warfare. The reason for this confusion comes from the German translation of the Lord of the Rings, where Harondor is described as a Verlassenes land, meaning abandoned. There's also geographical factors. Harondor's latitude and positioning, or at least northern Harondor, indicates that it should have had a similar climate and environment to Ithilien, so very much not a desert. The early history of Harondor isn't well known either. At one point, Nandor elves lived at the Ethir Anduin, but it's unclear and probably unlikely that they crossed south into Harondor. It's a fairly safe assumption that during the First Age and the early Second Age, Harondor's inhabitants were men, most likely of Haradrim origin, but possibly also of pre-Númenórean origin. However, halfway through the Second Age, the Númenóreans began to extensively colonize the coast of Middle-earth. Harondor would have been in an interesting spot, situated between Umbar, the northernmost port of the Kingsmen Númenóreans, and Pelagir, the southernmost port of the faithful Númenóreans. For this reason, it's possible Harondor was a buffer zone between the two feuding sides of Númenórean society. What we do know is that after the downfall of Númenor, Harondor did not become part of the Kingdom of Gondor, suggesting that it was not populated by faithful Númenóreans. If Harondor played a part in the War of the Last Alliance, it isn't said. Although the Haradrim and the Black Númenóreans both served in Sauron's armies, there's no mention of Gondor being attacked from the south, so these forces might not have passed through Gondor and instead may have entered Mordor from the east. Harondor next enters the history books during the rise of Taranon Falastur, the 12th king of Gondor, who ruled from 830 to 913 of the Third Age. Even when he was still the prince, Taranon Falastur embarked on wars of conquest for Gondor. He conquered lands west of the Anduin, presumably the coastline past Belfalas, and he also conquered lands south of the Anduin. Although it's not explicitly stated that these conquered lands were Harondor, it seems the only logical conclusion given that Harondor is the land directly south of the Anduin. Due to these conquests, and due to his expansion of the navy, Taranon Falastur was known as the first of the Ship Kings. Three more Ship Kings followed, Eärnil I, Kiriandil, and Hiarmendikil I, each king increasing Gondor's power in the south, including the capture of Umbar by Eärnil in 933. In 1050, Hiarmendikil decisively defeated the Black Númenóreans of Umbar, who had been trying to retake their city, as well as their allied Haradrim. As a result, Gondor seized the coastline all the way down to Umbar and inland to the River Harnan, and the Haradrim kings of near Harad were forced to pay tribute to Gondor. By this point, Harondor was now firmly under the control of Gondor, and given it provided the land route to Umbar, it was probably a fairly important province that received a fair amount of Gondorian investment. It's possible that the region saw a mixing of Gondorian and Haradrim culture, something that would have been fairly unique at the time. For over 600 years, Harondor would remain as part of Gondor. To put that into perspective, that's longer than the entire existence of Rohan. It's entirely possible that thanks to this long period of time, the people of Harondor began to consider themselves as Gondorian, and unfortunately, it was Gondorians that would spell the end of Harondor as a Gondorian province. In 1432, King Valakar died and the Kinstrife Civil War began, whereas the heartland of Gondor, such as Ithilien and Anorian, supported King Eldakar. Places such as Pelagir and Umbar threw their support behind the usurper Castamir. Situated between Pelagir and Umbar, and being a coastal province, it's almost certain that Harondor also threw its support behind Castamir. And although Castamir would be defeated and killed in 1447, the civil war would have longer lasting consequences. Castamir's sons were in command of the fleet at Pelagir, and they defected, sailing the ships south to Umbar, and starting a rival rebel realm. If the loss of the fleet wasn't damaging enough, then the loss of Umbar was catastrophic. Gondor's influence over Harad was now severely weakened, and the former tributaries began allying with the rebels in Umbar. Caught between Gondor and Harad, Harondor now became the battleground for the two sides. The next 2 centuries were bloody indeed. King Aldemir of Gondor died fighting the rebels and the Haradrim in 1540, but his son, Vinyarion, crushed them only 11 years later, taking the name Jarmendikill II. But the rebels would get their revenge in 1631. The great-grandsons of Castamir, Angamete and Sangayando would lead a raid on Pelagir, killing King Menadil in the process. During this time, Gondor had no real navy to speak of, so its main attacks against Harad and Umbar would have been on land, which meant marching through Harondor. We don't know how many battles were fought there or how many times the region changed hands, but it probably wasn't a peaceful time. Peace would come shortly afterwards though, but not for a good reason. In 1636, the Great Plague ripped through Gondor, killing King Telemnar and thousands, possibly even millions of others. King Tarondor, fearing that Gondor could be overrun, withdrew his forces from Gondor's outer territories. This included Enedwaith and Mordor. We're unsure if he did the same to Harondor. Given the land was considered to be debatable many centuries later, Gondor probably didn't officially relinquish its claim, but its ability to project force across the Anduin was severely weakened, at least for a time. That said, Gondor did make one last major play for Harad in 1810, when King Telúmatar Umbardikill stormed Umbar and killed the remaining descendants of Castamir. It's not stated whether he took Umbar by land or sea. Gondor did have a navy at the time, so it could have been by sea, but if it was by land, Gondor still must have controlled territory south of the Anduin in order to make a land connection to Umbar. But this victory was short-lived. The Wainwrither invasion started shortly after Telúmatar's death in 1850, and Gondor was forced to focus on its eastern frontier. Umbar was lost shortly afterwards. What this meant for Harondor is unknown. We do know that the kings of Harad started fighting amongst themselves, sparing Gondor's southern border at least for a while. But this came to an end in 1944 when the Wainwrithers and the Haradrim made an alliance to attack Gondor from both the north and south. Notably, Gondor did not try to defend Harondor, and instead, the Southern Army, led by General Eärnil, made its stand beyond the crossings of the Poros in southern Ithilien. We don't know whether Gondor had effectively relinquished control of Harondor at this point, or whether this was a strategic decision. The Watchful Peace followed. Once again, we don't know whether Gondor attempted to maintain some control over Harondor at this point. I feel like I've said that a lot in this video. But the likelihood decreased after the Watchful Peace was over and Mordor became active again, as Gondor now had a new front in the east. The new Corsairs of Umbar also became a lot more active, raiding Gondor as far west as Anfalas, and even landing several invasion forces over the centuries that followed. What we do know for certain is that by the reign of Steward Turin II, which began in 2882, Harondor was lost. It was said to have been completely occupied by the Haradrim at this time, and over the course of the next 3 years, there was plenty of fighting along the river Poros. This reached a peak in 2885 when the Haradrim attempted to invade Ithilien with a large force, but with the help of Rohan, Gondor was able to defeat their invaders. However, there is no indication that Gondor attempted to retake Harondor, and as Gondor's control over Ithilien waned over the next century, it seems unlikely that they would have tried to hold the land south of the Anduin. There's also the consideration of the fact that Harondor might have been partially or completely deserted at this point, owing to centuries of warfare between Gondor and Harad. For that reason, holding it might have been completely unviable, except as something of a buffer zone. Certainly, during the War of the Ring, Gondor did not have any forces south of the Anduin in Harondor. Instead, it seems that Harondor was used as a staging point for the Haradrim that were crossing into Gondor's southern fiefdoms. Gondor seems to have mounted a defense at the Ethir Anduin, which separated Gondor from Harondor, but considering that the Corsairs got as far north as Pelagir and the Haradrim got as far west as Linhir, it seems to have amounted to little. We don't know what exactly happened to Harondor after the war was over. In the months immediately following the war, emissaries from Harad did arrive, looking to make peace with Gondor. Given how quickly this occurred, it's possible that these Haradrim might have been from Harondor, or at the very least were from near Harad. But considering that Harondor was for a long time part of Gondor, and seemingly was never officially relinquished given its status as a debatable land, it's possible that Gondor might have tried to retake it at some point. Certainly, if they wanted to retake Umbar, then they would have had to have retaken Harondor as well. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. Sorry if I defaulted to the we don't know or it's unclear a lot during this video. Ultimately, what's important for me is to get the facts across and to make sure I'm not passing off my own beliefs or opinions as canon. So that requires me to make some disclaimers sometimes, or in the cases of some videos, a lot of times. Like many places, I wish we had more on Harondor, but alas, that's it. I believe there is a bunch of Middle-earth role-playing stuff on Harondor, so if you're interested in that, check that out. There's a city called Goberlin Calimon, which is such a great name. Unfortunately, non-canon. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you're from Northern Harondor, you're actually from North-South Gondor.